In March 2004, the quiet town of Farmersville, Texas, became the scene of a crime so brutal it would haunt the community for decades. Rachelle O'Neil Tolleson, a 20-year-old young mother, was simply trying to make a life for herself and her 5-month-old daughter when she vanished one evening. She didn't know that her path would cross with Moises Sandoval Mendoza, and that it would be the last night of her life. What happened next was horrifying. Tolleson was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, strangled, and stabbed. Her body was moved several times and ultimately set on fire in an attempt to erase the evidence. Back at her home, her baby girl was left alone, cold and crying, until family discovered her the next day. 6 days later, investigators recovered Rachelle's burned remains, identified only through dental records. The crime shocked Collin County. Mendoza, a troubled young man with a violent streak, was quickly arrested and charged with capital murder. By 2005, he was sentenced to die. But over the next 20 years, his lawyers fought appeal after appeal, arguing ineffective counsel, false testimony, and questions about his future dangerousness. Every challenge was denied. Finally, on April 23, 2025, after 2 decades on death row, Mendoza was escorted into Texas Huntsville Unit. Offered a last meal, he received only the standard prison tray. In his final moments, he turned to Rachelle's family and said, "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rachelle's life." Then, in Spanish, he said goodbye to his wife, sister, and friends. At 6:40 p.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection. It was the 3rd execution carried out in Texas that year. A young woman's life cut short, a child forced to grow up without her mother, and a killer who went to his grave with an apology that could never undo the pain. To understand how the murder of Rachelle Tolleson shook a community and how Moises Mendoza's final walk to the death chamber marked the end of a 21-year fight for justice, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is not just the story of a crime, it's the story of a life stolen and a reckoning that stretched across 2 decades. Rachelle O'Neil Tolleson was just 20 years old, a young mother doing her best to raise her 5-month-old daughter in the small town of Farmersville, Texas, a place where everyone knew each other's names and life moved at a slower pace. Friends and family remembered her as kind-hearted, hard-working, and devoted to the little girl who had become the center of her world. And although she lived in a modest home in Collin County, she carried big dreams for her child's future and a determination to provide the love and stability every mother wants to give. But on the evening of March 18, 2004, after leaving her baby at home with every intention of returning, Rachelle vanished into the night, never to come back. And by the following day, when her family found the infant cold, wet, and crying but miraculously alive, the chilling reality began to set in, that something terrible had happened to this bright young woman whose life should have been just beginning. Moises Sandoval Mendoza, a young man in his 20s at the time of the crime, was born and raised in Texas, coming of age in an environment marked by hardship, poverty, and instability that shaped much of his early life. Those who knew him described a person who struggled to find steady direction, often drifting between jobs and associations, while brushes with the law and mounting disciplinary problems painted the picture of someone already sliding toward a dangerous path. Prosecutors would later highlight his criminal record and his troubling behavior while in custody to argue that he posed what they called a future dangerousness, a legal standard in Texas capital cases that can mean the difference between life and death. But beyond the courtroom labels lay a complex and troubled background, a young man hardened by circumstance, influenced by poor choices, and fueled by a growing sense of recklessness. And by 2004, Mendoza's life had already taken a dark turn, one that foreshadowed tragedy. Yet nothing could have prepared the community or his eventual victim's family for what he would do on that March night, an act of violence so brutal that it would not only destroy the life of Rachelle Tolleson, but would also seal Mendoza's fate and set him on a path that would end in the death chamber more than 2 decades later. On the night of March 18, 2004, under circumstances that remain partly obscured but forever devastating in their outcome, Moises Sandoval Mendoza either lured or forced 20-year-old Rachelle Tolleson away from the modest home where she had left her 5-month-old daughter, and what followed was an ordeal of unimaginable cruelty. As Rachelle was kidnapped and subjected to sexual assault before being strangled and stabbed in an attack so violent that it left investigators stunned by its brutality. Unwilling to stop even after taking her life, Mendoza then attempted to cover his crime by moving her body several times, ultimately setting it on fire in a desperate and callous attempt to destroy the evidence. But despite his efforts to erase the truth, investigators would later recover her burned remains and confirm her identity only through dental records, a grim process that underscored the savagery of the crime. Meanwhile, back at her home, her baby girl had been left alone through the night, discovered cold, wet, and crying yet miraculously alive, a haunting detail that tore through the heart of the community. Because while Farmersville grieved the loss of a young mother whose life was stolen, the image of an infant abandoned in silence, waiting for a mother who would never return, became the most chilling reminder of what was lost and the depth of the violence that had occurred. When Rachelle Tolleson failed to return home on the night of March 18, 2004, and her infant daughter was discovered alone, cold, and crying, her worried family filed a missing person report that immediately set off alarm bells in the small town of Farmersville. And as investigators began piecing together her last known movements, they spoke with neighbors, friends, and potential witnesses who recalled seeing her in the company of Moises Sandoval Mendoza shortly before she vanished, a connection that quickly drew suspicion toward him. Forensic teams worked around the clock, combing through physical evidence, gathering samples, and following leads that tied Mendoza directly to Rachelle through both circumstantial details and scientific findings, building a case that grew stronger with each passing day. And within just a few days of her disappearance, law enforcement closed in on Mendoza, arresting him on suspicion of kidnapping and murder, a swift development that provided a measure of relief to a shaken community, but also opened the door to a years-long legal battle that would test the boundaries of justice and bring both Rachelle's family and Mendoza himself into the harsh spotlight of the Texas courts. In 2005, barely a year after the murder, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was brought into a Collin County courtroom to stand trial for capital murder. And as the proceedings unfolded, prosecutors laid out in painstaking and often graphic detail the brutality of Rachelle Tolleson's final hours, describing the kidnapping, the sexual assault, the strangulation, and the stabbing, before pointing to Mendoza's history of violence and his troubling conduct in custody as proof that he represented an ongoing threat to society even behind bars, while the defense countered by raising challenges to key parts of the state's narrative, questioning whether the evidence truly supported the claim of sexual assault and even suggesting that Rachelle may have initially left her home with Mendoza willingly. An argument meant to soften the perception of premeditation, but one that did little to sway the jurors who listened to the overwhelming evidence. After deliberating for only a short period, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. And with that decision, Mendoza's fate was sealed, as he was sentenced to death, a punishment that reflected not only the enormity of his crime, but also the deep sense of loss and outrage felt by the community that had been forever scarred by the murder of a young mother. For nearly 2 decades after his conviction, Moises Sandoval Mendoza and his attorneys fought an exhausting series of appeals in both state and federal courts, arguing that his trial had been marred by serious constitutional flaws, from claims of ineffective assistance of counsel for failing to fully investigate and present mitigating evidence, to accusations that false testimony from a detention officer had been used against him to exaggerate his so-called future dangerousness, to late surfacing affidavits from another inmate who claimed he could have contradicted key state witnesses but was never called to testify. Yet despite raising these arguments again and again in Texas appellate courts and later in filings before the United States Supreme Court, judges consistently upheld the conviction and death sentence, finding either that the issues lacked merit or that they had been raised too late to alter the outcome. And when all legal remedies were exhausted, Mendoza's final hope rested with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which had the power to recommend clemency to the governor. But in the end, that request, too, was denied, closing the last remaining door for a man whose case had wound its way through the justice system for more than 20 years. On April 23, 2025, after nearly 21 years of legal battles and 2 decades on death row, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was transferred under heavy guard to the Huntsville Unit, known as the Walls Unit, the site of Texas executions, where he was placed in a holding cell just steps away from the state's death chamber, and in keeping with Texas policy, he was offered a final meal. Though unlike the extravagant last request that once made headlines, his choice, if he made one at all, was limited to the standard prison cafeteria tray after the state ended the practice of special last meals years earlier, a stark reminder of how little remained under his control. As the hours ticked away, Mendoza was permitted visits with his family members and spiritual advisors, moments of quiet, emotional exchange in which final words, prayers, and farewells were spoken through the glass that separated them. While at the same time across the prison grounds, members of Rachelle Tolleson's family gathered, with heavy hearts, prepared at last to witness the justice they had waited 21 long years for, their presence serving as both a solemn vigil for a life stolen and a measure of closure in a case that had haunted their lives since the spring of 2004. Shortly after 6 p.m. on April 23, 2025, as the clock struck the final hour of his life, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was led from his holding cell into the brightly lit Texas death chamber at the Huntsville Unit, strapped onto the gurney with thick leather restraints, and given the chance to deliver a last statement before the lethal injection drugs began to flow. With witnesses from both his own family and the family of Rachelle Tolleson present just feet away, Mendoza spoke clearly, first turning to Rachelle's relatives with a message of contrition, saying, "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rachelle's life," before shifting into Spanish to address his wife, his sister, and 2 close friends, offering them words of love and goodbye in the final minutes they would ever hear his voice. And once he finished speaking, the warden gave the signal, the 4 lines were opened, and the lethal dose entered his veins, causing his breathing to slow until, at exactly 6:40 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Outside the prison gates, candlelight vigils flickered as reporters broadcast the news across Texas, marking Mendoza as the 3rd person executed in the state in 2025, a conclusion to a case that had spanned more than 2 decades and left behind a legacy of sorrow, questions of justice, and a reminder of the cost of violent crime. The story of Moises Sandoval Mendoza and Rachelle O'Neil Tolleson is, at its core, a tragedy that rippled across decades. The heartbreaking loss of a 20-year-old young mother whose life was stolen far too soon. The unimaginable reality of a baby girl left without her mother to guide her. And the heavy shadow of grief carried by family members who endured 21 long years of court hearings, appeals, and painful memories before justice was finally carried out. On the other side, a man who admitted his crime, but never stopped fighting for his own life through every legal avenue available, only to meet his end strapped to a gurney, his final words of apology incapable of erasing the suffering he caused. In the end, the justice system delivered its sentence, but the scars remain, etched into the hearts of those who loved Rachelle and into the memory of a community that will never forget what was lost. And as the prison gates closed and the case drew to its final chapter, the haunting reminder remains that for every act of violence, the pain extends far beyond the moment of the crime itself, leaving behind echoes of sorrow, resilience, and unanswered questions about justice and forgiveness. What are your thoughts on this case? And do you believe justice was truly served after so many years? Share your views in the comments below, and if you found this documentary meaningful, don't forget to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth true crime documentaries that explore the darkest corners of human behavior and the enduring quest for justice.